people don't have liberties, all the people don't have freedom, all the people don't have justice, and all the people don't have power, so that means none of us do. Take this country and change it. Turn it upside down and put the last first and the first last. Not only for black people, but for all people.
All the civil rights leaders, for various reasons, refuse or can't take a stand or have to go along with the administration. That's their business. But I'm afraid tonight that I know that justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, 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 everywhere.
You are
everywhere,
beautiful,
everywhere.
talented, and brilliant. You deserve the best. Do not let others who are intimidated by your greatness get you down. And certainly do not be afraid of your own greatness.
Dr. Octagon, paramedic fetus of the east with precinct from the church of the operating room with the strikes of force, scalpel since the Holocaust. I do indeed and greed, explore, meet the patients, back to rooms with the nurse with the voodoo curse. Holding up office lights, standing at huge heights, back and forth, left wing, swing to north, east and south with blood pouring down your mouth. I come prepared with the white suit and stethoscope, listen to your heartbeat, delete, beep, beep, beep. Your insurance is high, but my price is cheap. Look at the land. Blue flowers, growing by the purple pond. See the polka dots. Blue flowers, growing by the purple pond. Yellow indigo. Blue flowers, growing by the pond. Look, it's raining yellow. Would you care to listen to any more? Thank you. Holding bags on down right from the hospital. It's a patient's work to keep the germs off the turf. Cybernetic microscopes and metal antidotes to telescopes that magnifies eyes of a roach. Decomputed a cup of coffee planet with my hand and astral planet detached. Turn on rare foggers. Cut the light on the kid and turn it bright on. Supersonic waves combined and burn his brain waves. I see the mascot of evil. He's not Knievel. Shakespeare's gone. Don't even think about him. Yes, as I go into the park, I see blue flowers.
Back the oil in this AR off to find the cure for cancer. The dish in my blood, granny plotted to kill the master. Die about your freedom or you settle, it simply matter. I didn't write this chapter, Old Testament. Soul melanin, the whole revenant. That's what the slavish cross the board, gold medaling. A slave to a god, my it's all relative. It's still the world, don't give a what your fetish is. Collection plate and the OnlyFans. The dope was on the spoon, but now it's on demand. What's hyphy? Selling white sheets to hype beasts and turning plantations into Disneyland. Yeah.
That's the only way we gonna win, because that's how they did it. And I'm not mad at them. And when I say they, other cultures link up and they make it where nobody else comes in unless it's on their terms. I mean, that is logic. Like, what do the gangsters do?
What's a war wounded being murdered on the timeline? Watch you take your last breath and then just stand by. Watch you take your last breath and just stand by. Watch you take your last breath and then just... Fear put a glitch in your system. Make the hero the villain before I turn to a victim. Gave him Adderall, now they monetizing retention. Wanna clean blood money, non-profit religion. And inflate tuition, charging interest to reparate, for heaven's sake. Billboards on heaven's gates, y'all overate. Heard the chattel, know the cattle, didn't know their prey. Swing the procession, sideshow with the motorcade. All cried out, then my tank is on empty. Made it clear I got nothing to lose. Please don't tempt me, runaways, run the jewels. The rules don't fit me. Conduct the underground shooting at the glass cylinder. What's a war wounded being murdered on the timeline? Watch you take your last breath and then just stand by. Watch you take your last breath and just stand by. Watch you take your last breath and then just... What's a war wounded being murdered on the timeline? Watch you take your last breath and then just stand by. Watch you take your last breath and just stand by. Watch you take your last breath and then just...
To the drug dealers and killers, we the foundation, we the pillars, we the sound masons, we the realest. This is our nation, the people feel it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, honor over the dollar. play it in your jeweler. Then pull my mask away and evacuate with the moolah. I'm deeper than playing Donnie Hathaway on the tuba. Flash grenades from a trooper to fascinate your medulla. Master traits of a ruler, 5 pillars, so my rhymes realer, mind fillers. Fake gangsters that just time killers. I'm iller. I got a virus in my sinus that makes me spit up the livest bars. Makes you give up them lying frauds and make up the wisest God and live up the righteous laws. We on top cause we represent the highest cause. Freedom, justice, equality, Islam. See, I'm just an anomaly, pardon me, spit bombs. To the drug dealers and killers, we the foundation, we the pillars, we the tillers, we the sound masons, we the realest, this is our nation, the people feel us, to the drug dealers and killers, we the foundation, we the pillars, we the sound masons, we the realest, this is our nation, the people feel us. Bang to the boogie, say up jumps the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie in my fitted, in my hoodie. Don't ignore me, I'm still alive. Support me so I can strive. Bang to the boogie, say up jumps the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie in my fitted, in my hoodie. Don't ignore me, I'm still alive. Support me so I can strive.
How are we convinced boys to be builders when the tele-line vision say destroyers are winners? Ignore us till we make noise that Emmett Tillers. Throw us in the pit with the bone chilling as killers. Parents run parents, children ain't childlike. Failure they stare at it, closing their eyes tight. Shame and embarrassment, straighten up, fly right. Campaign carelessness, can't eat a sound bite. A lot broker than a stockbroker. Broke like your promises, choke on accomplishments. They only get behind shit to Heimlich. Make me throw up my hands cause I'm sick. No bootstraps to pull up. 2 straps for cash, get your crew strapped and roll up. This here's a hold up. Boarding hope up like a foreclosed storefront. They dug my soul up and never covered the hold up. You know what?
To the drug dealers and killers, we the foundation, we the pillars, we the tillers, we the sound masons, we the realest, this is our nation, the people feel us, to the drug dealers and killers, we the foundation, we the pillars, we the sound masons, we the realest, this is our nation, the people feel us.
Bang bang, boogie sit up, jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie. Come on, gotta look at me, don't ignore me, keep me alive. Support me, let me survive. The bang boogie, sit up, jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie. Come on, gotta look at me, don't ignore me, keep me alive. Support me, let me survive.
Dear white people, I am not your Negro. Yeah, black people, y'all just got your hero. All these rap demons, I'm about to depot. Me and Asada, my ATL and alter ego. The Queen of Sheba and Musa Keita, producer heater. Salute your teacher, my newest seed is a future leader. A testament of my evolution to excellence. To be or not to be human, that's what the question is. I'm still the answer regardless. Rappers is moving targets. Acknowledge me as the smartest passenger moving forward. My little sister bars blast like Kalishnikov. Just because heavy bass dance like Barishnikov. The sound pierce like bullets and swords from a nation under attack like bulletin boards, and I'm repping the foundation to the fullest, of course. Today another life was lost and it could have been yours, whether in Colorado or Colley Park. You but a mile apart from the sharpness of my remarks. The black oligarch making weaponry out of art. My supplier, soul messiah, told me we gotta talk. I walk through the dark. Now do I roll deep or do I hold heat? Now am I laid back or a control freak? Rocking the crown gilded in gold leaf. I'm from a place where the people dream but don't sleep.
You are now tuned in to the classics. This fine art leaders work to the masters. Ain't met a man or woman yet cause it passes. Cheers to the slaughter era, bow your head and raise your glasses. You are now tuned in to the classics. This fine art leaders work to the masters. Ain't met a man or woman yet cause it passes. Cheers to the slaughter era, bow your head and raise your glasses. Look, I don't wanna keep this dialogue alive, but they still don't know I'm out for blood, I'm not surprised. I keep my fangs well hidden behind a model smiles. And this tyrannical grammar stay italicized by design. I'm emphatically beast over every domain. I surveil prey in states of paralysis with my rabbit eyes. And me and thought together, portrait of your worst fears. The darkness come to light when 2 leviathans is fraternizing. My stock splintered from God's innards to moral sentences. Till every mob within yards beyond penitence. Squad minute for meanest demeanor and Lauren lyrics. We both guard in the tables and squat like salons. Titular album, homie, I'm scripture embodied. Holy 16, so the fiend, the redeemer. Picture of pious quoting my verses like I'm second coming. That's just one way that I've been heard described. I'm old bottler, causal Tupac in the causes. All eyes on me when I occupy space immersed in white. Cause I'm lit like a 7-day. My third eyelid stay wide open like it's broken. It's unsettling. It's a high risk going up against my pedigree. It's black thoughts and rock the ibis in his pedaway. You are now tuned into the classics. This fine art leaders work to the masters. Ain't met a man or woman yet, cause it passes. Cheers to the slaughter era. Bow your head and raise your glasses. You are now tuned into the classics. This fine art leaders work to the masters. Ain't met a man or woman yet, cause it passes. Cheers to the slaughter era. Bow your head and raise your glasses.
See, she's telepathic, call it black girl magic. Yeah, she scares the government, deja vu a tough man. We go missing by the hundreds. Ain't nobody checking for us, ain't nobody checking for us. The camera loves us, Oscar doesn't. Ain't nobody checking for us, ain't nobody. They want us in the kitchen, kill our sons with lynchings. We get loud about it. Oh, now we're the bitches. Look at what they did to my sister. Last century, last week. They put a body in a jar and forget her. They love how we repeat. Look at what they did to my sister. Last century, last week. They make her hate her own skin, treat her like a sin. But what they don't understand, but what they don't understand is, but what they don't understand, see what they don't understand. See, she's telepathic, call it black girl magic. Yeah, she scares the government, deja vu a tough man. She don't give up. Yeah, she don't give up. She don't give up. No, she don't give up. Rosa was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. Ella was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. Audrey was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. Angela was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. So Jenna was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. Asata was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. Rosa was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. Ella was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. See, she's telepathic, call it black girl magic. Yeah, she scares the government, deja vu a tough man. But what they don't understand, but what they don't understand is, but what they don't understand, see what they don't understand. She don't give up. Yeah, she don't give up. She don't give up. No, she don't give up.
And feminism isn't just for women. Is justice just for women? Is equality just for women? Is freedom just for women? I don't think so. We have to be in this together to be the change we want to see. We need alliances. We need friendship. We need solidarity. Walk with me.
Woke up and realized I was free to be anything. If it wasn't integrity with what I dreamed, I knew it couldn't be wrong and it would be done. I was born to be Earth's song, and I feel like I'm running, not away, but to take off and fly, using this life as a runaway. I feel like I'm running, not away, but to take off and fly, using this life as a runaway. Gone to sleep and other worlds I've seen, when my thoughts turn into things magical and tangible, and oh my, how fresh we would be if we took our dreams seriously, 'cause I feel like I'm running, not away, but to take off and fly, using this life as a runaway. I feel like I'm running, not away, but to take off and fly, using this life as a runaway.
Underground railroad flow with the river. God's gon' trouble the spirit dancing and mind gon' free. We still can't breathe. Everything we know of home, we've been forced to leave. Travel light, ready to go instinctively. We are all still running like thieves in the night. Following the North Star, we got away with our lives. For every time we were told we would not survive, and then rose from the ashes to see new heights. Harriet Tubman, Phoenix, reborn with a mic. Unconfined by time, shotgun at the side. We will rewrite tomorrow to defend black life.
Welcome to Freedom Dreaming Futures, a conversation about Black future possibility. We've been jamming to the uplifting mix produced by our resident journalist and DJ, Davey D. I'm your host, Hadari Davis, partner and CIO of Edutainment for Equity. E4E provides a variety of services, all aimed at social and cultural transformation through consulting, professional development, and artistic projects. Check our website, for more information if you're not on our website right now. We're excited to partner with San Francisco Dreamkeepers Initiative and the San Francisco Human Rights Commission to welcome our guest, Ytasha Womack, and speak in depth about the future of Afrofuturism. It is important to note this event, like most E4E events, is about the future of Black people. This event is sponsored by the San Francisco Dreamkeepers Initiative, which is a citywide effort to explore and provide reparations for Black people in San Francisco. Freedom Dreaming Futures is a series of conversations we've been holding with leading figures in Black thought and Black futures. This is a live stream virtual series intended to introduce challenges and triumphs of Black tomorrows by reflecting on the present and how we got here. We are active on several platforms. And those of you who have made it here this morning, we encourage you to share this link, this feed, this event with your colleagues, especially with other folks in your professional and personal communities. Invite your friends. We want everybody here. This is a free event intended to raise consciousness and criticality and orient ourselves to future possibility for Black people. We woke up in here, man. We woke. We awake. We wide awake. We want you to be awake too. Our big question for this series is, what will the future look like for Black people in 2033? How should we be approaching the future based on all we know about the present and the past? We're excited to welcome our guest to be in conversation with us about the future of Afrofuturism. We want to encourage you to use the hashtag Freedom Dreaming Futures, all one word, to ask questions and also to put questions in the chat. We hope to get to some of them with Ytasha before the end of our discussion today. But before we jump into this conversation about the future, we want to provide some context and some background for the topic. And we've devised a couple of ways to do that, beginning with this short presentation from our fearless leader, Candace Davis.
Thanks, Adari. Greetings, everyone. I'm Candace Wicks Davis, founding partner of Edutainment for Equity, and I'm here to provide some context for our conversation with Ytasha Womack about the future of Afrofuturism and Black possibility. Futurists say it's important to know where you are in the present if you want to get a sense of what to expect in the future. The context for the present is the past, and the context for the past is the present. Afrofuturism blends past, present, and future in the spirit of Sankofa, always looking back to look forward. So, assuming we come into this conversation after Black History Month, understanding where we've been, we thought we would begin March with a conversation about where we are going. As usual, we begin with the prophetic words of Afrofuturist Alicia Wormsley, who reminds us there are Black people in the future. This being true, what is our vision for the future? First, let's define the terms. What is Afrofuturism? Afrofuturism is a movement that re-envisions Black people through futuristic means. Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic, philosophy of science, and history that explores the intersection of African and African diaspora culture with science, technology, the future, and the ancient past. It is impossible to discuss Afrofuturism without beginning with the godmother of Black speculative fiction herself, Octavia Butler, whose imagination and brilliant writing carried Black possibility into new worlds, new unexplored lives, and new future possibilities. If you are interested in Afrofuturism and want to know where to start, any of her books will do. Her work has inspired a generation of speculative fiction writers, Black people who have dared to activate their imaginations in the effort to define Black futures. Our guest is one of those brilliant writers who built on the legacy of Octavia Butler. The legacy of Afrofuturism is also in direct conversation with the brilliance of this man, Sun Ra, whose interstellar imaginary helped to redefine Black people's relationship to space, the future, and to the past. Sun Ra is a musical portal into Afrofuturism, a meditation on Black future possibility. His work has been inspiring to many Black musicians and bands who have used visual art, costuming, technology, and sound to reimagine what Black music can look like, what it can accomplish, and what types of worlds it calls into being. Artists like Earth, Wind, and Fire, Parliament Funkadelic, Grace Jones, Miles Davis, Janelle Monáe, Missy Elliott, Busta Rhymes, Erykah Badu, Solange, and a host of others from various genres have borrowed from Sun Ra's aesthetic, his worldview, and even from his music. Many have limited the possibility of Afrofuturism to visual art, intending to box the expression in the creation of artifacts. For many, when they hear Afrofuturism, they think of images like these. However, Afrofuturism, even as an artistic impulse, has led to a variety of expressions and interpretations of Black future possibility. In architecture, like buildings from the imaginary world of Wakanda, in films, where places like Wakanda are made real, or stories of Black people from other planets or times are popular. Afrofuturistic artists have begun to express these ideas in the creation of new artistic modes, like this AI tech used to create these amazing images of iconic Black figures, or the creation of worlds through virtual reality that offer opportunities to see beyond the afterlife of slavery. All of these modes of expression expand our capacity to meet the challenges of today and usher in a better future. So what are the challenges of today that we're looking to the future to solve? Well, the schools where Black futures are being informed and instructed are behind. These schools are not filled with Black teachers or futurists. These schools are less funded than schools in other communities. These schools are under assault in multiple ways, including destabilizing the teaching profession and undermining Black thought in public education. The future will inherit a wealth gap that sees the rich getting richer year after year and the poor getting poorer. The association of these economic designations fall consistently along racial lines. Redlining and housing discrimination have worked in a multi-generational context to cement segregation into the housing structure of the country and have restricted Black future possibilities to specific geographic and environmental circumstances. These housing challenges result in environmental destruction and a disparate impact on the living conditions of Black people and in fueling health disparities that include high mortality rates, many comorbidities, and a general vulnerability. The opportunities that Black people in the present have to weigh in on these challenges through established means are also being constricted. We are struggling to make sure that we have representation in government and other institutions that matter to us. And despite our efforts, and as indicated in the previous slides, institutional racism and anti-Blackness is alive and well. It is through these lenses that we see a world, and these lenses are impacted by these challenges and the ideas that inform our futures. The accumulation of daily stressors from micro and macro level aggressions, unconscious and conscious bias, and discrimination contribute to trauma on a biological level. So I guess the last point to make is, when we discuss these challenges, we recognize the impact that they have on our brains, the brains of our children, and the brains of our future. Afrofuturism is a way to protect this brain by validating and valuing the perspectives formed by these experiences in the minds of Black people. We are not crazy. These things are happening, and we still plan to dream and create freedom in the future. And with that said, back to you, Hadari.
Thank you, Candace. As per usual, we asked our resident journalist and DJ Davey D to pose the question, what is Afrofuturism, to some important members of our community? Let's run that before we get into the dialogue with our guest.
Right now, Davey D, hanging out with you, City of Oakland, in front of Oakland School of the Arts, talking to activists and educators about Afrofuturism. I have somebody who is well-versed in this, and she's going to break it down. Ryan, you're a parent, educator, artist. What is Afrofuturism to you, and what lessons do you feel young people, maybe even your kids, are learning from it?
Well, the Bible says, you speak things that are not as though they were. And I believe Afrofuturism is exactly that. It's us walking a path that is not, first of all, it's not prescribed for us. Nobody outside of Afro people are expecting to see Black people in the future. So it's incumbent upon us to believe ourselves, dream ourselves, write ourselves, draw ourselves, sing ourselves, dance ourselves into the future that we want. And more than just dancing ourselves into the future, making sure that we are creating the right environments in our imaginations, the right sound, the right air, the right food, the right nutrition, right? Everything that we need to survive and thrive. We need to see ourselves in the future in that way. Afrofuturism has always done that job because there are so much of the context that we live in as a people doesn't expect to see us in the present, let alone see us thriving in the future. And so it's an absolute necessity as a mom, having my child watch things like Black Panther and Yasuke, which is actually the history, but helps them think about what's possible. And that's what's more important, is helping kids really see what could be possible when you think about Afrofuturism.
Sounds like you're talking about imagination.
That's all it is.
If you can put on your artist hat as a singer, writer, actress, how did Afrofuturism inform your work, and do your kids pick up on that?
I think so. So I've been an artist now for 20 years, and the place that we're standing right now didn't exist in the context that it exists right now. We are standing in front of Oakland School for the Arts. This was an idea and a dream that so many of us had. Oakland School for the Arts was in the Malunga Cascalord Center at the time that I started my artist career. And you could never dream or imagine that this thing would be possible. But it was artists like myself that dreamed that, you know what, we should have students and artists, young burgeoning artists, sit atop a high-class, state-of-the-art theater facility so they could feel what it was like to professionalize their careers as artists, and look at where we are now and look at who comes out of it. And so, yes, my kids, I see the evidence of dreaming into the future, and my kids see what's possible. I hope, you know, they're very young, but I believe in a couple of years they'll be able to see the fruits of the labor of imagination.
Ryan, Nicole, we appreciate it. We got a few more people we're going to talk to. Peace out.
Yo, greetings. This is Ross Ceylon, organizer, educator, and artist out of the Bay Area, speaking on Afrofuturism. Now, there's many different definitions, textbook definitions that you can give for Afrofuturism. But for me, when I think about it, I think about stellar individuals such as the musician Sun Ra. I reflect on the writings of Octavia Butler. I think about films like Wakanda Forever and different things of that nature, of Saul Williams' recent Neptune Frost, right? All of these are expressions that center Blackness in a way that is not defined by the gaze or the perspective or the lens of the West, right? Allowing the future of African people to be not defined by anything in this reality, but only the limits of the imagination, which is infinite. All right. So for the youth, for the next generation, I think it really is important, because what it does is it expands their consciousness to think about themselves in a global context. In fact, in a universal context, right? And to understand that the cosmology of their essence connects to everything that exists in this entire multiverse. You know what I mean? So I think it can spark the imagination, and it could create some positive futures. So big up to all those Afrofuturists out there and those to come. Peace.
Hi, my name is Sean Taylor. I'm a folklorist, pop culture and fandom scholar. I believe that Afrofuturism is taking up where hip hop left off. It's a place for us to dream ourselves into a future that's not beholden to white imagination. We have our own cosmology, eschatology, epistemology, all the ologies that are coming out of Afrofuturism. We no longer have to tiptoe into white imagination to try to form ourselves. What Afrofuturism does, I think, for children is that it activates their dream machinery in a way that allows them to see themselves past trauma. Because so much Black art, whether it's visual, auditory, whatever, it's always been in terms of resisting the status quo or resistance against white supremacy. What Afrofuturism is allowing these young folks to do is disavow white supremacy and to create whole new worlds that suit them, suit their needs, that gives them exactly what they need to see themselves outside of the vision of white supremacy. It allows Black children to imagine new worlds and then build those worlds and then land on those worlds and then come back and tell us what is there. That is powerful. It's taking what some could term as fictional and making it a reality, then also operationalizing that new reality in hopes of a better future. The kids are in good hands with Afrofuturism.
Thank you, Davey. We want to encourage all of you to use the chat or hashtag Freedom Dreaming Futures. all one word, to ask questions, make comments, and let us know that you're here. With that, we want to welcome and introduce Ytasha Womack, who's an award-winning author, public intellectual, artist, filmmaker, dancer. She is the embodiment of Afrofuturism, a polymath whose ideas have helped define a movement, author of the seminal book, Afrofuturism, Speculative Fiction, and the Creation of Black Worlds. Ytasha, welcome to Freedom Dreaming Futures. We're honored and delighted to have you here with us.
Thank you.
To get started, we want to help orient the audience to this type of futures thinking. I want to encourage all of you, wherever you are, to answer these questions for yourself, perhaps even writing your own answers down. We're asking Ytasha to share her vision of the future with us, and we have to be in the right state of mind to hear it. So the first question is really kind of on a scale. To what degree are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of Black people? 1 in 4 are degrees of optimism. 6 and 10 are degrees of pessimism. There is no 5. There's no middle of the fence. You got to choose one side or the other, with 1 being the most optimistic and 10 being the most pessimistic. So that's the first question. To provide context, are you optimistic, hopeful, or pessimistic, anxious about the future of Black people? What number would you rate your response and why?
1.
1. So why 1? Why so optimistic?
Well, 1, because I recognize that there are people who made a lot of decisions before me to be in the space and to exercise a lot of the freedoms and rights that I have, right? So I am therefore living in someone else's future where they took steps for me to be able to have the kinds of conversations and dialogues and live with a relative state and have a certain set of freedoms. But I also recognize that we are informed by our concept of what we think is going to happen in the future. So I'm acknowledging that while we have visionaries who help to craft that future that we move into, many of us might not necessarily think of ourselves as a visionary, but you can have a fortitude and a relative determination and a belief that there should be a future that values humanity and our earth. And when you have that belief that there should be one, you are empowered or feel informed by this possible future, and you take actions to ensure that there is one. So for me, it's not so much a matter of what is someone else going to do that's going to send the future in one direction or another. It's a question of, do I think such a future that values the earth and humanity should exist? And do I believe it enough to take some steps to ensure that I contribute to the effort to make it actually exist? You know, so there are people who did things before us. Maybe they didn't always believe. Maybe someone else held the vision. Maybe they wanted to believe in the person who held the vision. But they said, you know what? This has to stop. The inhumanity has to stop. And I would rather contribute to the space of valuing humanity than not. And where it lands is where it lands, but I know that I'm going to take some steps, big or small, to ensure that, for myself, for others, because it's the right thing to do.
No, that's really powerful. I think what I hear you saying is that inherent in Afrofuturism is an optimism at its base, a belief in a possibility.
Right. And I think that the belief in that possibility has a lot to do with the fact that there's a recognition that, many people of African descent are coming out of spaces where there was an apocalypse. The apocalypse in our communities happened with the transatlantic slave trade, the onset of enslavement, the colonization of various countries. So it's not that you are moving in towards the apocalypse. You're moving out of an apocalypse. And yeah, there's a level of surrealism taking place. But all of that to say that there's a recognition that things had been worse. Now, and that's something you can't deny, right?
Right. Woo! Okay, so we're here with Ytasha Womack, acclaimed author and outspoken advocate for Afrofuturism. We want to encourage all of you in the audience to prepare questions. We'll have a Q&A at the conclusion of our conversation, sometime in the middle of the conversation. So our next question is going to center on the larger topic of discussion, which is really the future of the Afrofuture. But I kind of want to ask you to provide some context for us on this future that we're to consider. Afrofuture, the future of Afrofuture is really a meta idea, right? So what is it about Afrofuturism that's led to such an amazing renaissance of Black art and Black innovation? And what is your sort of idea about where that's headed, where that's going? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think, people of African descent, like, or on the continent, like people of all cultures, have always had a relationship to space and time. I've always had a relationship to some idea of a future or an imagined space or an altered space. And I think in more recent years, people were able to sort of find one another and connect around these ideas, in part because the term Afrofuturism became a bit more popular. The rise of the term Afrofuturism coincided with the release of my book, Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture. The same year that book came out, or the same month that book came out, there was the Studio Museum did a art show called the Shadow Took Shape, which was a major Afrofuturist retrospective. You had a major anthology that came out at the same time called the Mother Box Connection. And I think that, and simultaneously, social media was picking up. So there's that space. I'm really thinking about moving into the teens, the 20 teens. So there was this I don't know, some people call it a zeitgeist moment, but it's this moment when things started to really intersect. You have this term, Afrofuturism, which becomes a little more popular, and people are able to see examples of it in real time. And it gives a context to some work that they were creating, to things that many people grew up with, people who may have grown up looking at, listening to the some of the spiritual jazz of the late 60s, early 70s. People who are listening to Earth, Wind, and Fire and looking at the Parliament Funkadelic and the analysis there, but also people who were thinking a great deal about how to navigate futures. And maybe they're looking to African diasporic mysticism to get a certain kind of relationship to time. And so suddenly people are starting to see how certain works they were already kind of familiar with, or ideas, fell into this larger category that we call Afrofuturism. And I think about the comics. There were a lot of indie comic movements that were taking place. And then, simultaneously, as we're moving into like the 20 teens, science fiction was taken a little more seriously in the academy. And the increased speed of a lot of the technologies, that we were utilizing. I mean, the public in general, more people started using, more people were utilizing smartphones. More people had personal computers in their home, more laptops. And so this integration of a certain kind of technology in our lives started to feel like the future. Barack Obama becomes president, the impossible becomes possible, a Black man becoming president. And so suddenly there's a different sort of context for seeing these changes. And so all of that mixed together, you think about Afrofuturism, this term sort of coming to light, and it brings together the people who were making the comics, where they're bridging ancient Egypt and the space-tastic future. And then you look at these album covers from the 70s, and then you're looking at the technology, utilized in the creation of hip hop. And then you think about all these Black inventors, and then you think about these visionaries, or the song Ezekiel, what is it? Ezekiel and the Will in the Sky, these gospel songs. And you're just like, oh, wait a second. Afrofuturism is a term that connects all of these things. So people who were on one side versus the others were able to see one another, in part because the term brought it to light.
Do you feel like it's is it just a term? Like, is it just a case that holds these things, or does it have a intention? Does it have a purpose in that way?
I think that, see, here's the thing sometimes with being in a cultural space where there's an idea that there's a dominant cultural space, right? Sometimes it's hard for people to see themselves. And you could be thinking all kinds of things, and you don't see it until it's in a book that you find on a shelf and talking back to you. And you're like, wait a second, I thought these ideas, I felt this way. Me and my friends were doing this. I didn't know this was a thing until I saw it in a bookshelf in a store. And it's like, wait, that's me. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
Totally.
I think there's a lot of elements sometimes within the culture where it's hard to see what we're doing because we're constantly contending with these lenses that are projected upon us and then told to dismiss those things, which we could be thinking and feeling inherently because it doesn't fit in a box.
How much do you feel sort of the Afro-futuristic impulse is a response to the apocalypse? Or how much is it sort of kind of a post-apocalyptic reach for kind of the same type of freedom that Harriet was reaching for chasing a North Star? Like how much is this a byproduct of our enslavement? Is it truly a diasporic sort of understanding that we've developed about past, present, and future? Or is it beyond that?
You know, it's interesting. When I talk to people about Afrofuturism and they say, you know, well, what is it exactly? I tell them it's a way of looking at futures or alternate realities, but through this Black cultural lens. And the example I give, I say, you see it, it's an artistic aesthetic, it's a way of thinking. You know, I talk about it as a way of sort of healing ideas about the imagination. But at the heart of it, you have Black cultures at the center. And Black cultures, that's with an S, African diasporic cultures. And you have these intersecting spokes of imagination, liberation, technology, mysticism, and anything you would describe as Afrofuturist sort of falls in that category, right? But here's what's interesting. Your relationship to space and time is in part informed by where you are. So, you know, whether you're in San Francisco or Chicago or Bahia or Accra or Berlin, and you're a Black person, your experience is there, your lived experience, whatever your migrational story as to how you got there, you know, in addition, it in part shapes your relationship to space and time. But here's what people don't always get. Those relationships, in terms of how you experience space and time, is complementary. There's a complementary relationship between how I, as an African American woman, am thinking about space and time, and how someone, a dancer from the Ivory Coast who's in Paris, is thinking about space and time, because we're working around the same rhythm bases, just as dancer performers. We're working with complementary rhythms in terms of the music that we're working with. So a lot of our relationship to space and time is inherent in our cultural elements, whether it's your art, your architecture, music, dance, etc. We don't always think of it that way, right? You know, it's not always phrased that way as a relationship to space and time, but it's embedded in that way so that it moves through these cultures as you move from one space to another. So when you ask, do I see it as a response to a post-apocalyptic dynamic, or is it more like, you know, Harriet Tubman? I see it as a reach towards moving out of a box. Now, sometimes that's the colonial box, right? Sometimes that's the more of a sort of a personal framework of boxes that you were told you were supposed to fit in, which could be colonial, but not necessarily, right? I think it's about people trying to find a freedom on one hand, reimagining themselves in this imagined space, in order to connect with those things which are within them. But also, that freedom is about a sort of Africanness that people are looking to assert in spaces where they are told that you aren't supposed to do that. And people might not even know it's an Africanness, depending on where they are. That these philosophies and this way of thinking about the world might be more African and indigenous in nature. And then you're in a society that says, no, you're not supposed to approach it that way. So I think it's reaching towards an Africanness, expression of a kind of Africanness, and then also an expression of a sort of freedom. It's a bit of both. And as a result, I think Afrofuturism, we talk about it being different from other kinds of futurisms because it looks at future, past, and present as sort of all informing one another, sometimes experienced as one, sometimes happening simultaneously. There's a lot of philosophical thought about that. But I think essentially, just on a basic level, if you think about being informed by your imagined idea of a future, in addition to whatever your relationship in the past is, you're being informed on all sides of time.
Omni-geographic, omni-temporal. We're talking to Ytasha Womack. She's here dropping these gems for us. I want to move a little bit from I think that some people have labeled Afrofuturism as strictly a creative practice or theoretical kind of an ideology, a way of seeing, and not in speculation more than provocation. And I think that there's kind of a lens that's been placed on Afrofuturism like it's an artistic movement, when I think that that's probably true. That's part of the story, but it's not the whole story, because there's other elements of this game that are very material and not just ideas. Technology, for example, or kind of the ways in which our music or our idea about music are able to manipulate certain things. So can we talk a little bit about kind of the practical application of Afrofuturism in real time?
Yeah, sure. Well, part of it is, if you are an artist, right, literally being able to create an image, of a future that engages Black people, and there being able to get that into a market of people who want to buy it. Right. So there is a practicality in that, right? People are coming up with stories, and then sometimes they were going into dynamics until somewhat recently where they were saying, hey, no one wants to hear that story or this fictional story you're telling about a Black person. We're not putting it out. So that there's a practicality there. Someone, has an art piece and it engages space and art and time and a kind of surrealism. All of these things are an Afro surrealism all in one. And then they say, hey, this is the theme of my art show. And people saying, a gatekeeper type saying, the market doesn't want that. So there's a practicality there. Right. I mean, there's many science fiction story, novel, piece, artwork that people, put in their closets because they were told there was no avenue for it. And then had to pull out. And now there's more of a demand. So that's, so sometimes when people talk about art, like, oh, it's just dreams and wishful spaces. Well, not for the people creating this stuff who are looking to make a living from it.
Right.
Or who at least want the satisfaction of having an audience engage with that work.
Right.
And take it take it relatively seriously. So there's that. But then outside of that realm, it's very basic for me. What do you envision for the next? And do you feel like you have agency in doing so? That's real basic, right? What do you think should happen next? Because we're always engaging in the space of other people's imaginations. Someone made this platform that we're using. Someone designed this computer that we're on. Someone imagined the roads and streets that we drive on. Someone envisioned the vehicles that we ride. Someone dictated what colors they should come in. You know what I'm saying? And then there's things that we create and dictate as well, and choices that we make. And, so there's a bit of a co-creation process in this. But you have as much of an ability to imagine and enact those things that you imagine as ideally other people do as well. So it becomes sort of a conversation of who can imagine something and put it into practice, and who's told they can't imagine something and put it into practice.
Right. Right.
Right. So to me, it just gets very basic in that sense. You have an idea for something that can resolve an issue. You want to put that idea into practice to resolve the issue. That can be Afrofuturism, depending on what all you're talking about. Right? You have this, you're contemplating this. Whether it's a program or it's an app or it's a new system of doing things that you feel values the earth and values humanity and empowers people and engages community, then yeah, there's an aspect of that which could be very Afrofuturist as you're taking it from the dream space and you're moving it into a reality. So it's yes, there's the wish upon the star, right? You want to acknowledge, you want to acknowledge our astrological bodies out here, these planetary bodies, because you are a person in an expansive, ever expanding universe that's doubling in size every trillionth of a second or something. I'm a little off on that one, but it's something very close. And I just, so yes, you're a person on this earth. And inherently, many of us are creative beings because you're always imagining something. You're imagining something all the time, whether it's an image, whether it's a sensation. Someone tells you, hey, meet me at the cafe later today. You either have an image of that cafe, you have a feeling about what it's going to be when you're in that cafe. You might even have an idea what you're going to drink. You start thinking about what you might wear. You're thinking about how you're going to get there. You are imagining because you've done none of this. Right? So, sometimes we remix images that have been put before us and call that our imagination. And you just want to kind of be clear about the fact that you're imagining something all the time. So it would help to be more intentional about that and have some sort of expectation around it, and take the actions to be moved towards these spaces.
We're talking to Ytasha Womack about imaginations and the future and possibility, and I think it's interesting to think about the African imagination and what the African art, African creativity, indigenous culture. There was often no distinction between art and spirit, or the sacred and the creative. That those spaces, whether it was in song or in some type of totem or in a garment or some other type of artifact, that was actually honored as a sacred thing, not just as a piece of art that you hang on a wall and kind of observe from a distance. So I guess my question for you is, what's the sacred side of Afrofuturism?
Well, I think the sacred side is recognizing that the imagination is a gift. And crafting any sort of vision is a muscle to be worked, particularly when you're imagining something or envisioning something that you do not see in your environment. It can seem very magical to think about a kind of freedom that you don't feel like you're experiencing. It can feel otherworldly to want to be in a career that you are not currently in. Particularly when you have no idea how to get from step A to step Z, right? These things can feel very out of your world. But through relative optimism, it can kind of shift your vibration just enough to be able to see a certain kind of possibility as you start taking actions towards it. And I think, if there's a sacredness, it's just that the imagination is, it's a tool. People say, oh, the imagination is a tool, but it is very much a gift. It is something that makes us very unique as human beings. Perhaps animals are imagining as well, other animals are imagining. I can't really speak towards that specifically, but we do know that we are. And that makes us a little different, from some of our other, from some of the other animals walking the earth. And I think that treasuring that as a gift and then using it to empower is just helpful.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because earlier when you were talking about the apocalypse and sort of it having happened already, that one of the things that was taken in part was imagination, or at least limited and restricted. But then at the same time, imagination was the star that we chased. It was the freedom that we saw that we had never seen or experienced before. It was the idea that we could be out of this condition, or that generations later we would know how to read, write, and have our own power and energy. I was talking to some young people the other day. I was like, your great grandparents were dreaming for you to come. They prayed for you to be here. So that's, as you know, what I really like about this concept of this idea that you've been talking about, time. It's almost like you're blending it all into one space, from the ancient past to this starlight future, and then everything in between, all kind of in one space. I don't know, it's like the flattening of time and geography into one space.
Well, and you see that in a lot of our Afrofuturist art, right? I mean, think about Sun Ra, the jazz icon who, is both wearing the Egyptian solar disk, but then simultaneously saying that he's from Saturn, and talking about going to an altered destiny. You see it when you look on, Parliament Funkadelic album covers. It's funny. I was just listening to Mother Box or Mothership Connection again. There's a anthology called Mother Box Connection, so I had to always go back and say, they're pulling it from the Mothership Connection, and it sort of dawned on me as I was listening. He was talking about, being a protector of the pyramids and protecting the funk and so forth. And there's always this tug of war about in these narratives, and the narrative that they had about either someone's trying to steal the funk or they're bringing the funk, and the funk was basically like the Force in Star Wars, where they're talking about an essence of life, and a very integral essence of life that they are in some ways protecting, something that they see as otherworldly or certainly universal. And so when they're talking about the Mothership Connection landing, the spaceship landing, it's about bringing all that happiness and joy and knowledge, bringing it and anchoring it in a very present sense, right? But then simultaneously, they're talking about the pyramids, being protectors. And there's one narrative, I almost need to go back and to tell you the specific songs, because you grow up hearing this stuff. You're like, la, 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 this is great. And then you go back, you're like, wait, what did he say?
All the time.
Right. So, I mean, it's not just my framing. It's a framing that you see in just a lot of Afrofuturistic works, sampling in hip hop. You're taking fabrics of songs and speeches and poems and elements of sound, some of which wasn't even designed to be musical, and you're creating a tapestry with it and moving that forward. That's a very Sankofic kind of idea, right? And there's a lot of examples when you start thinking about, a lot of our cultures where you see that sort of element. There are a lot of people, I mean, just within the African continent in general, when you look at the traditional spiritual forms, there's not a difference between physical and non-physical life. They're kind of all sharing the same space, where you can be informed by ancestors, and you can be informed by spirit deities, and then here you are on earth and you're engaging with these. There's a different language when you come out of some of these particular traditions to speak to that. But, at the same time, in some of our diasporic spaces outside of your actual spiritual traditions, just in terms of how people align ideas is really interesting.
Mm. I know that there's been critiques about Afrofuturism on the continent, about it being overly diasporic or rooted in kind of a Western sensibility of what Blackness is and what Black culture is, what our apocalyptic past is. Do you have a perspective on that at all?
Well, people are going to write from the perspectives that they're in. So if you're African American, you're going to write from an African American perspective. Those are going to be some of your primary reference points. If you're in Bahia, you're going to write from a Brazilian reference point. If you're in Ghana, you're going to write from a Ghanaian reference point. I think the term itself came of age in the United States. And some of the first people writing about the term using the word Afrofuturism were scholars coming out of America and the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So that became some of the initial framing. But even in some of that initial framing, people who were African American or of the UK, et cetera, they were actively, and a lot of people who were African using the term as well. But I'll just speak of the African American vantage point. We're always talking about the African continent as a reference.
Mm-hmm.
There was no point where they were acting like, and this is just our thing, and it's not someone else's.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Derry, who initially wrote the Black to the Future essay, when he was noticing some of these patterns in African American works, he saw it as specifically African American. But the people who built upon it after him did not.
Right.
And we're very specific in saying that, myself included, right?
Right.
I think what you now have, you have anthologies like Africa Risen, which Cherie Renee Thomas and several others helped put together, which is an anthology of writings from people on the continent, the Americas, and elsewhere. And so people are now able to kind of look at a lot of the creative works in one context and think of it as various approaches to Afrofuturism. And I think all of that's important.
Mm-hmm.
So, the criticisms, are the criticisms. But I think what's most important is that we have now helped to carve out a space where there could even be a criticism.
Right.
Where there could be a platform for people to talk about speculative works or to be able to platform the ways various African creatives and storytellers have been telling stories for some time. Because sometimes, I know people, if they're not from the West, they look at things that people do in the West and they're like, wait, we're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait, what are they calling it? Oh, they're calling it this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait, we're sort of doing this, but the way they're doing it, all of that's fine because collaboratively, the works that we're doing are all helping one another.
Right. Feeding one another.
Right.
So we spoke yesterday about the difference between the world of future forecasting and the Black worlds of the Afrofuture. I made the point that strategic foresight is not often placed the future of Black people in the forefront. So in this way, Afrofuturism plays a role in the collective Black imaginary. And I guess Afrofuturism claiming that imaginary is actually setting that imagination free. Yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think that the professional forecast world has this corner on reading the future, right? Looking 5, 10, 20 years in the future and prognosticating or perhaps putting things together to strategically think about future possibility. And that's not something that has been a practice that has been dominant in our communities, in our cultures. We don't approach the future that way. Afrofuture approaches that kind of forecast in a different way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think Afrofuturism, in my experience, centers community. And it acknowledges that there are things that happened in the past, some of which we'd like to move into the future, some of which we do not want to move into the future, and that has to be interrogated.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no building a future as if you're building it on top of some clean slate. You are contending with people with lived experiences who've had a unique set of insights, and then also historical perspectives, which shapes why you even think you need the clean slate. So you can't just deny a host of histories and say we're going to, build this new thing and then not acknowledge those histories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, to the extent, I don't know, in some circles some of that's acknowledged, and in some circles a little less so. I think sometimes it's perceived that sometimes there's elements where it seems as if Black people are thought of not just as an afterthought, but almost as if we need to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
How are you trying to support us in catching up? Not that there could be answers within a lot of the practices around resilience or kind of survival within some of the things that we are already doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've read some really. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
No, I mean, I remember reading some books, and there being some speculation where I could tell they hit a wall around how to even think about certain kind of ideas, frameworks. And I said, wow, they're hitting this wall because they're only looking at Eurocentric frameworks. They're not looking at African diasporic, African American frameworks on. And so it's like the answer that you're looking for isn't another framework. Totally. Assuming that, various individuals even know that they're in that framework at all. And that, I see that sort of on a regular basis. In some spaces people are talking about, oh, we need to think about how to build community. There's kind of reference points. I couldn't escape from community if I wanted to. I can move to the other side of the world and I'm still going to hear about what so and such did in so and such church, and what so and such did in high school. And I'm going to be I could not answer any emails, letters, come back after 20 years and hear the same information as if I had never left, right? So, so there are community spaces that are already sort of functioning in that way. I tend to be, something my mother says is either you're a community person or you're not. You bring community with you. Either you're engaging with the people around you as if you feel like we're part of a community and you act accordingly, or that's just not quite how you're thinking. Community can't be based on transactional relationships.
Right.
I did this for you, and because I did this, then you have to do this thing for me. There has to be a bond which is deeper than that in some ways. And I don't always know what that comes from exactly. And I'm not saying all spaces that are community are utopic either. But I think there is something to say about why some people feel a connection that doesn't necessarily have to do with shared traumas or shared identities. And then some people don't necessarily feel that connection. All of this to say, in some of my engagements and with some dynamics of forecasting, no, Black people aren't centralized. To the extent they are, they're seen as a problem that needs to be resolved, as instead of a space where answers currently exist.
It's so interesting that you say that. It reminds me of the green movement and the movement towards environment. And there was all this thing about people need to recycle their clothes, or maybe you should figure out ways to value jars and other sort of containers that come into your home. Maybe you can repurpose your containers, or You know, this
Right.
is stuff that we, you know,
How to save your grease in a canister.
yeah, you know what I mean? Like all these strategies that were survival strategies for our people, especially through the Great Migration, bringing seed.
Strategies that we were told to abandon in
Mhm.
order to become more modern.
Mm.
That's what I really thought about. I mean, at the onset of the pandemic, it's interesting all the things that sort of came to me around how you kind of build and conserve. A lot of which you grew up with, or if it wasn't you, your grandparents, certain things they did.
Mhm.
I live in the Midwest. There used to be this whole idea of the deep freezer.
Mm.
A friend of mine, Sean, talked about this all the time. If you were a person trying to have some sense of means, you always wanted to have a deep freezer where you had all these frozen meats.
Mm.
And part of it had to do with there was going to be a winter storm and you might not be able to get to the store. And some of it had to do with this idea of having big families. Even if you didn't have a big family, you came from a family that at one time was big and you wanted to store all this stuff, right? And in case there was some kind of emergency, this idea of not throwing certain things out. Hey, you might need it. You might need that extra, the box, the this, the that. It's interesting, then in this more kind of postmodern world, you were told, no, you don't need to save, have all these frozen items. You don't need to act like you're cooking for a family of 10 and it's just two people in the house.
Right.
You don't need to do. And then the pandemic hits, where are you? Right?
All those skills, all of that knowledge became extremely valuable.
Right. Right. So, I'm not saying you have to continue doing everything, but what I am saying is there's answers in a lot of the practices, and to look at it in that context instead of just dismissing it as old timey or not aligned with, a kind of certain way of moving forward, is to dismiss where it came from and what it was about.
That's really possible. We're talking with Ytasha Womack about the past now. We're not we're talking about the Afro past and how it informs the Afro future. That's where we're at now. Contextualizing the practices of our grandparents and our great grandparents, our ancestors, and finding value in those practices for the future times that we're living in, for not only these current times, but for the future times that we anticipate, whether it's dealing with climate, dealing with migration, dealing with the challenges of limited resources or scarcity in terms of life-giving things that you need, food, shelter, water, etc. That our ancestors found ways to get those things, secure those things, divine, innovate, create, invent those things so that they could overcome some of those challenges. And it seems like the loss of memory of that actual practical knowledge could actually lead to a future that we don't want. So we want to, in this conversation, what I hear you saying is that we need to remember the practices of our ancestors.
Remember the practices, and to the extent you don't have to do the practice, what was behind it. Maybe the practice, you don't need to do the practice, but at least understand the idea behind it, because it's the idea behind it that might be an element of survival, or elements to build upon.
Yeah. Earlier you said we're post-apocalyptic where other people are pre-apocalyptic. Is that what you're saying? That other people are headed towards the apocalypse and we're headed away from the apocalypse?
Well, one of the perspectives in Afrofuturism is, yes, we generally, the idea is you're moving out of an apocalypse, whereas other sorts of science fiction, sometimes you're moving towards one. And, that's a bit of a crossroads, right? That's where our cyberpunk meets what I'll call our kind of earlier Afrofuturism. I think about Sun Ra, and he says it's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? There have been many ends to things, but within those ends was always the seeds of a new beginning, or a beginning that was already taking place and is then revealed, right? And so, it can become a question sometimes of, I don't want to just say riding waves, but certainly recognizing a certain set of patterns.
Right. Okay. All right. Now we have a game called the 4 Paths. We're about to play a game. Each path is a doorway to the future. Each doorway has a specific parameter. One is about growth, while another is about collapse. The third is about constraint, while the fourth is about transformation. So here we are forecasting 4 possible paths for the future of Afrofuturism. I will call out the path, and then I'll ask you, Ytasha, to describe the future you see. Okay, so we're going to start with, I always think it's the easy one, but none of them are really easy. So we'll start with growth. That is the continued growth and evolution of the form and idea of Afrofuturism. What will it become? What can it touch? What does the growth of this movement look like?
I think the growth of the movement from the creative standpoint means you have more speculative worlds for people to engage in that are informed by African diasporic perspectives. And that can be a range of things. All of them aren't utopic. All of them aren't spaces you say, hey, this is the world for me. But it is you just have more stories, books, films, etc., that are outgrowths of the Black speculative imagination that are surreal. Maybe sometimes they have these elements of horror. They deal with all these features. And I think the cool thing about that is that it just helps expand other people's imaginations and gives them more worlds of story to engage with. So I think that's one. When it comes to future Afrofuturism. And then I think, it also supports people in just reminding them about the role of the imagination in those things through which they're creating. The extent to which you're able to think about the thing you imagine and finding ways to put it into some form of practice, big or small.
So moving from the imaginary to the material.
Mm-hmm. Or being very cognizant of it in a way where it's not just centered on what you might feel is the struggle, right? Because sometimes people get so lost in the struggle of something legitimately, right? Some of these struggles are not easy, that you can forget, or you're not focusing on what it's supposed to look like on the other side.
Right.
I think some of us have been in dynamics, from organizational standpoints where they reach a goal or you're about to reach a goal and people are like, no, if we reach the goal, then, it's going to change this, it's going to change that. And you're like, my whole identity, my job's going to change. You're like, no, we want to reach the goal. You want to be on the other side. Mm-hmm. You're not going to lose your job because we reached the goal. Mm-hmm. If your job was created to resolve an issue, if we resolve an issue, then we'll get you another job, right?
And another issue.
Right. And another issue, but you want the issue resolved. You want to keep the issue in play, to because you feel it's going to sustain you.
Yeah, that's a statement about the nonprofit industrial complex. So, okay, let's look at this next one. Let's look at collapse. What if Afrofuturism was seen as a fad? What if it faded away? What would that collapse symbolize? How would it impact the lives of Black people?
It would evolve with another name and they call it something else. Because before it was Afrofuturism, there were spaces where other communities of people and friends got together and called it something else. Whether it was Black science fiction or it was rhythmism, right? Or it was they called it a number of things. They gave it was the name of their Maroon Society. You know what I'm saying? So the name works for what we're doing at this point. If if it shifts, it'll resurface as something else because we're talking about a human relationship to space and time. And that can't that doesn't vanish regardless of what you call it.
Okay, so what about constraint? What if we get more of the same? Hollywood films, art shows, just a heavy emphasis on the artistic aspect of Afrofuturism and kind of subordination of this transformative lens that we can have on the idea of space and time, either through technology, through education. I mean, there's all kinds of platforms. So what if we're looking at constraint now, which means we get more of what we're getting now, more Hollywood films, more art shows, art.
It's funny. If you get more of the art, because so many people compare their lives and are informed by these films and things and books and things that they're reading, they would be changed anyway. I mean, that would be huge. If every time I turn on television and a third of the projects were people of color, people of African descent, engaged in future speculative worlds, a third. How different would that be? I mean, you don't even have a third of the content out reflecting Black worlds currently. So, I don't want to minimize the impact that could have.
Right.
And not just on Black people, but just on other people, in terms of just thinking and speculating about futures. I think it's so interesting, Nichelle Nichols. Many of us are familiar with the story about Martin Luther King encouraging the Nichelle Nichols to stay on the Star Trek show, right? And we're also, well, I'm sure many of you might also be familiar with the fact that she then, in real life was asked by NASA to recruit women to be in the space program for NASA. So, sure, here's a woman who, for a number of decades, didn't have many lines, incredibly charismatic and informed and, empowered on this particular show. And the impact she had was on women actually going to NASA. You ask any woman who went to space, Black, white, or otherwise, who in part inspired her, and they all say Nichelle Nichols. A fictitious character on a television show. If you ask anyone, you say, name one character, one Black science fiction character, they're going to name Uhura.
Yeah.
So, our artistic lens has an impact that's, a little grander than we think, in part because so much of our world we process through story.
Wow. Okay, so then let's imagine transformation. So we can do this one or another way. Afrofuturism is transformed into something else. What does it become? Or Afrofuturism transform the world, and what does the world become? So which one do you want to, which one do you like? Afrofuturism is transformed, and what does Afrofuturism become? Or the world is transformed by Afrofuturism, and what does the world become?
You pick.
Let's do the transformation of Afrofuturism. What could it be? We had a guest on our Man on the Street who said Afrofuturism is the generational descendant of hip hop, or it's where hip hop leaves off and where the future begins. I thought that was really interesting because that
is interesting.
I had never thought about it that way. And then
I can see it that way. I see where he's going with that, though.
Yeah, he's and then another. Go ahead.
No. What was the other one?
And then Afrofuturism, imagining worlds beyond the limitations of the past, which is a little bit similar to this afterlife of slavery, but it's also without that as a limit, without what happened to us, whether it's Jim Crow or mass incarceration, et cetera, without what happened to us or even what's currently happening as a limit to what's possible, which I also thought that was kind of interesting too. Very, very imaginary. So
no, I agree with that.
So let's talk about the transformation of Afrofuturism. If it's the generational a child of, it's next in line from hip hop, and if it's worlds beyond the struggles that we've experienced in our past, then what could it transform us into, or what could it be transformed into?
Yeah, it's interesting when you use the hip hop as a metaphor. I think about how often a lot of rappers, particularly in the initial stages, and still in a lot of respects today, they talked about hip hop as a nation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you look at KRS-One, he even breaks down what the rules of these nations are, and what the 9 elements of hip hop. He expanded the elements of hip hop, so there's a groundwork, there's a philosophy, it's a space. And he looked at people as sort of communing around, these sort of ancient ideas that are spoken through racism in part, right? In addition to the other 8 principles that he listed, right? If you want to center like Afrofuturism is coming out of that, right? In part, right? You think of hip hop as being sort of a descendant of a space where, I don't know, hip hop is completely postmodern. It transformed our music and how we think about music into another space. It took a lot of these electronic elements and then used as a foundation, etc. So I think of it as this real, as if you think about it as nation or space of like total remix, where you're being very much in a present, but then it's sort of catapulting towards another space.
Absolutely.
And Afrofuturism, if you want to think about it, as being an outgrowth of it in part, right? And of course, I would tie in the lineages of like a lot of spiritual jazz and all of that, because a lot of that was about worlds of a future.
Right.
Then if it was in part transformed, I could see it being transformed in terms of maybe people creating actual communities and spaces that reflected it. That I could see, and then it becomes you're utilizing space in a more material kind of way. Just so from an imaginative standpoint, if based on KRS's principles around hip hop, if he had created an actual nation, because there were points, I don't know if you ever read the hip hop Bible that KRS-One wrote. I mean, there were moments in there where he was really almost speaking of hip hop as like the sovereign nation. And it was people of the world, of good intentions and good spirit and all of that, right? And so, it would be interesting, as people are talking about sort of these futuristic cities, if there are people who would say, okay, you know what, I'm looking to create these spaces and we're using some ideas as Afrofuturism as a sort of foundational way of engaging in another kind of sense. So I could see it evolving in that kind of way, in one sense. And then, people name the community what they name it, hypothetically, right? I could sort of see that being interesting.
Yeah, it's earlier you said that sometimes our imaginations are hijacked by the things we've seen or the things we've heard. And I think before Wakanda, like pre the Marvel version of this Black futuristic world, we saw something different. Like our minds had a different imaginary. But as soon as you kind of present this on film, buildings and structures and like electronics, you're almost setting that as our expectation for what the future world could look like. And I think that in and of itself is really, it just harkens back to what you were saying earlier about the hijacking of our imaginations and then kind of the showcasing. This is the only pop kind of solidifies what we think is possible, right? Solidifies our possibility.
Right. And it's sort of, now this is fun. I have a book coming out in October, and it's called Black Panther, A Cultural Exploration, but it's looking at the elements of the comic specifically and how they're informed. A lot of those elements in the comic, I had the pleasure of reading every single Black Panther issue. how much of that, a lot of the ideas about Wakanda, seem to be aligned with some very real spaces.
Right.
Right. So sometimes even the imagination that's sort of projected for you, it's not coming from an outside space. It can sometimes be a variation of things communally that happened or were imagined, and it might be presented to you in a certain kind of way. There was a guy I interviewed, and he said that he's a writer out of Nigeria, a speculative fiction writer. And he said when he looked at the Black Panther film, to him, and I guess from the perspective of the community he was a part of, it was looked at, oh, this is kind of like a retro future, like a fantastic story about things we already kind of did.
Yeah.
And he's thinking about a particular relationship to various African empires and societies, that it sort of exists. It's like, oh, this is kind of a fantastic version of that, right?
Yeah.
And that's one relationship to it. Versus say people looking at it and thinking, oh, wow, look at these technologies. And this is going to inspire me to get into STEM and to do some other kind of work because I want to create the fantastic version, So, there's things that, from various spaces that can be presented as if it's outside of you. And the sources
indicate it might be inside of you.
Precisely.
Right? That's the Matrix. There's just so many different stories that seems like they're byproducts of somebody else's imagination when really they're reflections of your own life story, your own experience, your own perspective. So
right. And that's in part why you connect to some aspect of it.
Okay, that was great. We are so thankful to have such an informed and interesting outlook on the future. We want to take a short break. We want to give our guests a moment to sip some coffee and to sort through some of your questions. And while we do that, we'll be blessed by a short artistic offering from Candace Davis, aka Candace Antique. This Afrofuturistic music video is lo-fi, but it captures some of the spirit of what we've been discussing as Afrofuture, as past, present, and future as one.
Be like the water. Antique. Yeah. This is a house built upon sand. This is the land. This was the plan. This is deception. This is defeat. This was the trick filled with deceit. Let's make a wave to destroy this house that's built on sand. Let's make a wave to destroy this house that's built on sand. They keep you poor and desperate. Then when you steal, they lock you up. It's a setup. There is enough for you to have all that you want. Let's make a wave to destroy this house that's built on sand. Let's make a wave to destroy this house that's built on sand.
Beat guy.
The water is strong, it can wet down anything with a little time. So carry on, drop after drop, be relentless, don't ever stop. Let's make a wave to destroy this house that's built on sand. Let's make a wave to destroy this house that's built on sand. Be like the water. 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 Let's make a wave to destroy this house that's built on sand. Yeah. Let's make a wave.
Welcome back with Ytasha Womack. Thank you, Candace, for that brilliant song and those incredible visuals that I had a role in participating in making. So thank me. Ytasha, thank you for your patience and grace as we move through our agenda. We have some questions from the audience that we want to go through. Let's look at this first one is about STEM, black folks in STEM. So do you see the low numbers of Black people percentage-wise in tech and in STEM fields as a barrier towards the future of Afrofuturism? Do you think that the lack of Black bodies in the science fields in particular limits the growth of the movement?
I think it's, I won't say it limits the growth of the movement, but I will say it's very important to have kids who have an interest in science or could be very good in science to be supported in that as they're, and to see that as a viable option. You know, I think about, you know, I was a kid who wanted to go into the sciences, so it's kind of funny that I'm in Afrofuturism now. But I think about kids who maybe liked science, but just didn't see the relationship between how you move from your interest in science to a career in science.
Right.
Or maybe being in spaces where they're working with teachers who don't see how they're going to move from that standpoint either, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think it's important to know science to, you know, just foundationally to be able to create a lot of these technologies. But then simultaneously, I think it's important to recognize that all technology, you know, is not gadget centered, right? Technologies are also systems and ways of thinking,
Right.
you know, so it's a mix of both. I think it's important to have people of African descent in all areas.
Yeah,
So
I
that
think it's an interesting question in the context of our own cultural practice, because we never described our cultural practice as science, even though, or technology, right? So you talked about you know, George Clinton's album and music literally articulating scientific ideas, literally articulating you know, anti-temporal or say omnitemporal, omnigeographic sensibilities within a song that we would call art, but is actually in as much that's science as well, right? He's literally using imaginary concepts. He's got technology involved. Like there's just a lot in that we discount.
right.
Right.
I mean, if he had called it, instead of saying, you know, bring the funk, he said, bring the particles, you know?
Right. Right. So
You know?
sometimes it's like the words, but I do think that, and maybe this harkens to something you said earlier, but there's a magic of our being able to do things or produce certain things from our own sort of cultural and social experience that other people can't produce. And then that in and of itself is a technology that's kind of unique to our ability to produce that something from nothingness that hip hop is kind of related to this idea, right? Of like taking what you said earlier, taking something that's an imaginary, an idea, and making it material and reality. Like I think I can take this break that exists in this form and I can extend it to this form. And when I do that, it's going to change the way everybody behaves. That's like a scientific, that's a lab experiment.
Well, what's sort of interesting, I was at this event once and, you know, I was there in a circle, you know, and asked to talk about Afrofuturism. And there were other people in the circle who were Black, but weren't necessarily Afrofuturists or hadn't thought of themselves that way. And all of us were able to kind of go back and forth about these ideas and talk about them. And for some of the people in the circle who were, you know, white Americans, I got the impression that there was this idea of, wait a minute. This isn't just her talking about this idea, like these other people here who are knowledgeable in some other area also are familiar with these concepts and think the same way. And it's not like the five of us had all got together and had a discussion and said these are going to be the foundations of Afrofuturism and we're going to build from there. But there's so many elements of it that are reflective in aspects of the culture that if you're a Black person who's been has some relationship to Black cultures, then there's some elements of it like, oh yeah, you're just sort of familiar with as you speak it aloud. So almost to the point where you don't realize it's that unique.
Right. We look unique, but it may not be that unique. This question is, how do we apply Afrofuturism to economics and politics?
Well, I guess in the simple sense, you think about politically, what does the climate need to be for people of African descent or the continent to fully express themselves? To be able to take those dreams and have the agency and be supported in them coming into fruition. What are the political dynamics that ensure that? And then what are the economic dynamics that ensure that? So yeah, that's the way I think about that. And then you say, oh, okay, great. Well, we came up with those things, but what are the steps? I would also say once you kind of come up with that framework, to then think about other moments where that's been done in some shape, form, or fashion before, big or small. Whether you're talking about a neighborhood or a society or family or something, so it doesn't feel like you're completely, remaking the wheel and see, okay, well, what worked there and what didn't work? Or what can you build from and what do you not have to build from?
Yeah, that's interesting. That it made me think of Maurice Bishop, actually. What did you think about Black Panther 2? Is Marvel co-opting Afrofuturism?
Well, I would say no, they aren't co-opting Afrofuturism, in part because to me, your relation, people can create all kinds of things with tropes that pull from Afrofuturist works, right? Just generally speaking. But your relationship to space and time is your relationship to space and time. That doesn't dissipate, based on how stories are being told. And then more specifically, I mean, in the creative realm, you think about Black Panther, you had a lot of Black creators who played a role in shaping the story and telling that story. And that's really important. People did a lot of work, a lot of research to try to tie these ideas and bring them together. And so the vision, in part, was shaped by those creators. As far as what I thought about Black Panther 2, I thought it was amazing. I thought it was simply amazing. I thought it was brilliant. Certainly brilliant in the scope of the Marvel Universe, but just brilliant in general because you're dealing with something we'd never really saw before, which was a superhero who passed away at a young age at the peak of its franchise. Where do you go from there? Right? So whatever story they had in mind, you now have to rework it in a way where that figure isn't central. But what was brilliant about it is that it sort of did something that's a bit of a theme in the Black Panther comic and a bit of a theme in terms of how a lot of Black communities often think, which is it goes back to community. It's not about the one person. The one person, the one savior, the one leader, and what they did. We've been in circumstances where we had the leader, they're not alive. Some were assassinated, right? Somewhere, there's certain scenarios, certain things happen. That particular leader of those efforts was not there. But it's the spirit of what they were talking about that lived on. Right? And people came together and built from that standpoint, in easy ways and ways that weren't easy. I mean, these were some of these leaders who were over some of these particular movements, who I'm referencing. They were the visionary, right? They were the visionary, the charismatic, they were the everything. And when they're not there, people can say, forget it. And some people did, but a lot of people did not, right? And they said, no, we've gone too far. This is what they taught us.
We got to keep
and we want to take those elements and remix it and move forward. Because these moments of freedoms that people have experienced, there's too much at stake, and there's too much growth that's taking place, right? So that I appreciate it for that. And I also appreciate it because it showed how people can deal with grief.
Mm.
You know, you had Shuri's character who was very angry. You had the Neymar character who was very angry. They were all very angry for very real reasons that many of us can relate and connect to.
Mm.
And they could sit and burn in their own flames if they wanted to, but it's like, you know what? It's the community.
Mm.
So, you know, I'm going to say something that happened at the end of the film, everyone. So if you haven't seen Black Panther 2, just kind of cover your seconds. All right. Okay. So Shuri had the opportunity to kill Neymar, and she did not. What was the two images that came to her? One, she remembered the people.
Mm.
When Neymar took her into his water world, she saw those people, the community. She related to that. She was like, I can't destroy these people and their belief in this guy and how he has led them through this unusual circumstance of survival underwater. Number one. And two, you know, she remembered her mom, who this man killed.
Mm.
Literally saying, her mom comes to her and says, show him who we are. We're bigger than this.
Mm.
Right? It's not about what you think it's about.
Mm.
You know, it's about the communities living peacefully, and you're not going to put that all in flames because of your anger.
Mm.
A justified anger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to lead from this standpoint of love. And so the two of them came together, you know, and there's the end of the film. That I thought was really deep.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, just in a very real sense, you know, outside of certain movements, people learning people in movements, you know, this idea of, you know, certain women, you know, what they've lost brothers, they've lost partners, you know, and to show women who've lost men in their lives, men who played some very central role, right? And their coming of age or in their life, for them to be able to reconcile with that, find a space to reconcile with that and move forward. I thought it was really deep.
I thought it was great. Yeah, and I think I just thought everything you said today was great. I really appreciate the time that you took with us to share this insight. And I think that your vision and ideas about Afrofuturism are really transforming a lot of people. It's not just your visions, but the way that you've articulated them. It makes it easier for us to understand what we're seeing, to make the connections to the past that are really necessary for us to understand not only where it comes from where it's going. Just really appreciative of the time that you took with us. So thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you. This has been the best. I appreciate. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you for inviting me to be here and to share, and you know, just value your imagination and your agency.
Imagination, agency, and community. Those are the three words. Imagination and community being the key to our future, the key to the Afro future. You can purchase Ytasha's pioneering book on all platforms. We like to direct you to Black-owned bookstores to make that purchase. So visit marcusbooks.com or unclebobbies.com or any local Black bookstore that's close to where you are, and pick up her wonderful book and the new book that's coming out in October. Let's say we want to thank our other guests. We want to thank everyone who played a role in this production. You can find Candace Antique's music on all platforms, including YouTube, Bandcamp, and iTunes. We're really appreciative of her work. We want to thank Ryan Nicole, Ross Ceylon, and Sean Taylor for their insights. Cheryl Davis at the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, the the legendary DJ Davey D, and all the folks at E for E, and you, our audience, for showing up and showing out. My name is Hadari Davis. You can find me at edutainmentforequity.com. Until next time, keep dreaming. There is freedom in our future. There is freedom in our future. Imagine that. Imagine that. Peace.